off by heart, and they're all raps. So next week we're doing the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. Don't pretend you don't know it. Before we get into this, let's pray. Heavenly Father, as we come together this morning, I just pray that you speak to each one of us. I thank you for the depth of revelation and knowledge and wisdom that is in your word. Thank you that is true for us as individuals, as humanity, and as a group gathering here to praise you this morning. Please take my failings and my limitations and speak through me. In Jesus' mighty name. Amen. So, we're looking at the story there of Jacob wrestling with God. But we need to get some context to this, so I'll do that in a few moments. But the theme is connecting whilst fleeing. So Jacob had done a lot of fleeing, which we'll see in a few moments. But I think we all have situations in our lives that we flee from. Whether it's a physical situation, whether it's a relationship that's broken down or is a struggle, whether it's a circumstance, whether it's people, or whether it's a feeling that we want to compartmentalise and shut away because we just don't want to face it. We don't want to face that issue and all that it brings up. So we're looking at that, how we can connect with God while we're fleeing. We're going to look particularly at Jacob and the brawl that he had. And this story features Jacob heavily. And I like Jacob, and I've always liked him. So there's a few characters that I don't know about you, but I just get drawn to, and Jacob has always been one of those. I think when I was writing down how I would describe Jacob, the word that I wrote down was scamp. And then I had to Google what the proper definition, in case there was different connotations historically that would make it inappropriate today. So I looked up what scamp meant. And the dictionary says it's a person who is mischievous in a likeable or amusing way. That is my school report right there, ladies and gentlemen. And I like that Jacob is a bit of a scamp, and yet God uses him. It gives me hope, and maybe it gives you hope too. You can see he's a bit of a rebel and a bit of an opportunist. He does all he can to get what he wants. And sometimes, a lot of times, that includes deception. And I'm not sure if any people here have watched a TV show called Game of Thrones. Now, I know there's different opinions on Game of Thrones and the content, and I'm not here to discuss the merits of that. That is up to you to do that amongst yourselves. But I think Game of Thrones has absolutely nothing on the Old Testament. Game of Thrones and the like are tame in comparison to the things that we see in the Old Testament. Some of the betrayal, some of the stories, some of the different things that have gone on, it's like, it's tame. And normally on these TV shows, you will get a recap of what has happened before, so you can understand what is happening now. So we're going to do a little bit of that, because this passage that we've had read to us today and that we've looked at is good, and there's a lot in there, but it's even put into greater context when we look at what has happened before. So let's do a recap. Previously in Genesis. So we have Isaac and Rebekah. And Rebekah has a brother called Laban, who we'll see more of later. Rebekah became pregnant. And it said that the babies jostled within her. Now that sounds uncomfortable to me. But she prayed to God, and this is what God told her. He said, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 people within you will be separated. 1 people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. At this point, I bet she was sorry that she mentioned it. So Isaac and Rebekah had twin boys. Esau and Jacob. Esau was born first, and he came out red and hairy. And Esau was named Esau because Esau means hairy or rough. Imagine if that way of naming children continued. Hi, I'd like to introduce you to my children. Whiny, blotchy, chubby, and baldy, etc. So I don't know what you would have been called if your parents took that literal approach. But then Jacob came behind Esau. And it said, the Bible tells us he was holding on to his heel. And his name means to follow, to be behind. And also it means to supplant, circumvent, and overreach. And it has connections to the word heel itself. So literally, the name Jacob meant to grasp the heel. In the culture of the time, it figuratively meant the one who deceives. So he was giving his brother a hard time in the womb, and he comes out of the womb using his brother for his own convenience. He grabbed hold of his heel and said, I'll let you do the work. Sibling rivalry right there. What else do we know about Jacob? The Bible tells us he was quiet. It says Esau was a good hunter. Jacob was quiet. It's like I had no other skills for him. He was quiet. We know that he was a mummy's boy in the fact that it said that he was his mother's favourite. And I do like the Bible's honesty in this. It does it as well with actual Jacob had a favourite son, Joseph, which I'm sure we'll hear about in a few weeks. But nowadays, if you say to parents of multiple children, which one's your favourite? It's just not the done thing. And so it's not a biblical model we should follow. Love all of your children equally. That's one you can have. But it continues this sibling rivalry. And if you have siblings, you may well be able to relate to this, although possibly not to the degree we're going to get into. So as Esau was the firstborn, he has a birthright. So this would mean that he would get a double portion, so he'd get twice as much of Jacob as of his father's inheritance. And when his father died, he would be the leader of the clan and of the family. And it tells us that one day while Esau is out hunting, Jacob is at home cooking soup. And Esau comes back and he says he's exhausted and he's famished because he must have been hunting a long time. And he really wants some of this soup. So he said, quick, let me have some of that stew. And Jacob says, there's an opportunity here. So he says, I'll give you some of this stew if you give me your birthright. So Esau says, well, if I don't have something to eat, I'm going to die. And what use is my birthright to me then? Esau is destined to rule over Jacob for his whole life. But he sacrifices that for a bowl of soup. And this exchange here tells us a little bit, or maybe a great deal actually, about both of these brothers. So he steals his birthright, so he gets what is rightfully his by negotiating, rather than saying, yes, of course, dear brother, you can have some of this soup. He takes what he wants. And later it gets worse. He goes on and as their father is getting older, he wants to bless his firstborn son. He wants to give him a blessing. So he says, there's a lot of stew goes on in this story, but he says, I want to give you a blessing. Go and get some animals, come back and we'll make a stew and then I will eat it the nice way and then I'll bless you. I'm not sure what the theological significance is, but we'll work that out. So he says, and then I'll give you the blessing. I'll give you the blessing because you're the firstborn. And it's all deception here. So then their mother overhears and she says, I'm not having that. Jacob, come here. Your dad wants to give your brother a blessing, but I think he should give you it. So if you go and get some things, I'll make the stew, we'll give it to your dad and we'll pretend you're your brother and then you can have the blessing, as well as the birthright that you took from him over some stew. Right? So he goes, well, yeah, but Esau's hairy. That's why you called him Hairy. That's his name. My dad's not going to believe it's me. I know his eyes are gone, but he'll feel. So then they trick him by putting some animal fur in him and it works. So he has stolen his birthright, what is rightfully his, and then the blessing that his father wanted to give to him. At this point, it seems like the final straw. Esau wants to kill his brother. And again, if you're a sibling, I have a younger sister, and the amount of times when I was younger, I'd say, I'm going to kill you. I don't think this is that. I think he really means it. He literally means he wants to kill him. So then the mother, who's been involved in all this, says, I tell you what, you've stolen his birthright, everything that was his. You've tortured him most of his life. Now you've stolen his blessing. Go and stay with your uncle until he calms down. Or until he forgets about it. So he does that. He goes and stays with his uncle, and he sees this girl, and he falls in love with her. Turns out it's his cousin. Told you, Game of Thrones. All right, so it turns out it's his cousin. And he works 7 years so that he can marry this woman. So he works for his uncle for 7 years so he can marry this girl that he's met and fell in love with. But his uncle, also a bit of a swizzer, says, he gives him the other sister. Because he's saying, well, she, I'm not going to really get rid of her. She's the first, so she should go. So then Jacob, rather than saying, well, this is not the terms of our agreement, and fight in his corner, says, what do I have to do to get the wife I actually want? And his uncle says, well, if you work another 7 years, and Jacob's thinking, well, I wonder if my brother's calmed down yet. Not judging by his Facebook posts, he hasn't. So I've got seven years. So he works for another 7 years and gets his wife. And in this, it's funny, when you read the Bible, it's like we get an oversight over what everybody's thinking. But at the time, they didn't know what was going on. There was loads of different things happening and backwards and forwards. So he has 2 wives. And it gets a bit more complicated, but I urge you to read it for yourself. But between his 2 wives and his 2 wives' maidservants, he has 11 sons. It tells us he also has a daughter. So these different things. And then he wants to leave to go back to his home. But there was all kinds of things going on around, sheep and goats and different things. And this led to Jacob fleeing again. So he'd left his home because of the mess he'd created, because of what he'd done to his brother, because of the deception, and he'd left to go there. And then he was here now, and he was fleeing this place to go back to where he came from. So ultimately, at the end, Jacob was fleeing his uncle to go back to his home where he'd been fleeing from in the first place. There's a lot of fleeing. But in the whole journey, when he left the place and the consequences and the situation that he was trying to get away from, God was still meeting with him. He met with angels, and he had a dream, and the whole story of Jacob's ladder and the different things, we read that God was still talking to him. He had fled his past, and now he was fleeing his present by returning to face his past. So he was constantly seemed to be running away from something. And then all this is going on, so then they're coming back, and Jacob says, right, we're on the way, we're going to see my brother, I'm sure it'll be fine, it's been 20 years, I'm sure he's got over it now. So he sends some messengers and says, go and tell him I'm coming. Tell him a few things, send a few gifts, try and butter him up, he'll be sweet. The messengers come back, and it didn't go really to plan. It says, Esau's coming to see you, and he's bringing 400 men with him. Now, what you think? That's a bit overkill. He could have said, I want a couple of the big lads come with me, we'll go on, and this will intimidate him. For 400 men, I think he's overdoing it a bit there. He was still mad, or so it seemed. And that brings us up to what we've heard today. Brings us to this point. So what he's done, he knows his brother's coming. He said, right, all of this stuff, I've got my wives, the livestock, my sons. If I split them in 2, then even if he comes and kills half of them, I've still got this. So that's his thinking. That's the level he's at. So then we read what we heard today. The questions that come from that is, who was the man that Jacob wrestled with? Hosea suggests it was an angel. But without question, because people have argued it for years and we're not going to solve it this morning, without question it was a representative of God. And every text that refers to it is God is there. What was the wrestling was my second question. So when I think of wrestling, I think of what used to be called WWF. with all of the music and Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. I know some people may go back with giant haystacks and Big Daddy and stuff. But I think that, but I don't really know, I've never wrestled in my life. So anyway, that's just a thing. What was the wrestling? What did it mean? Was it literal? Was it figurative? Was it both? Was it spiritual? And why was there wrestling? Could God just come and say, don't worry, Jacob, I'll sort this out, I'll be with you? He could, and he already had. Maybe he just required something of Jacob. He needed an encounter with Jacob to get Jacob to persevere, to enhance his faith. Because rather than just him telling him, he needed to experience it. And in this, sometimes I think when you're preparing a sermon, so for me the Bible is full of knowledge and wisdom and revelation, and there's real gold in there. And when you're preparing a sermon, sometimes it's like mining for that gold. And there's some passages that you can delve into and instantly you know what the main point is. And it's like pulling out a big lump of gold. And all you're going to do is clean it off and present it. And sometimes you just get a load of little nuggets. Now they all add up to the same, but it comes out differently. And I'm not saying that I am providing gold. God has done that. I'm just someone that's trying to mine it. So this morning, I've just got a few thoughts that I want to share with you off the back of this. But with that said, I think there's two main things, and I'll get to them in a few moments. But Jacob had initially fled from the consequences of his actions. He avoided his responsibility, which we heard about last week also with David. And he'd also fled from all that God had for him, because when he was younger, God had spoken to him. And his lineage, there was prophecy through that lineage. And he'd fled from all that God had for him there. He had fled from his destiny. And God had told him to go back and deal with the situation so that his plan and purpose for Jacob could be fulfilled. Sometimes we have to deal with our past so that our present and our future is unlocked. In all of this, the two key points that I think, if you get nothing else, take these two key points with you. The first one is that God is with you. Whatever it is that you're fleeing from, whatever it is that you're struggling with, whatever it is that you're wrestling over, that God is with you. It's not based on your personality, the same it wasn't for Jacob. It's not based on your character. It's based on God's grace. He is with you. The second thing is that there is power in stopping, turning around, and facing whatever it is that you're fleeing from. Because that's where this happened for Jacob. God was consistently evident through Jacob's fleeing. There was a dream, there was the angel, there was a wrestling. We can't outrun God. As the psalmist brilliantly puts it, where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? Whatever Jacob was doing for his own gain, wherever he was going to try and get away from his own mess, God was with him. Jacob was in a situation of high fear and distress. And the Bible tells us that he prayed, which is good, and he reminded God of what God had promised. He said, God, you said that if I go back, you'll do this, you will be with me. And sometimes I struggle with this, and some people in this room will know that over the last week that I have done. That sometimes I'm in a situation of high anxiety and stress, like Jacob, and I'll remind God of what he said, so I know what God has said. I know the promises God has given me, and then I'll still continue to worry. And I think, and it's not an excuse, but I think the fact that it's in there so much is don't worry, don't be anxious, is because God knows there's a tendency within us to be anxious. But sometimes when I pray like Jacob did, remind God of what he said, and then go back to worrying about it. Another point is that God initiated this encounter. God sought Jacob out because for whatever it was, he needed to get him over push him over the line. It wasn't just words and saying, I'll be with you, wasn't enough. God initiated this encounter. He started the wrestle. Another key thing I think it's important to note is that Jacob was alone. He'd sent all his family and everybody else ahead, and he was alone when this happened. And I think sometimes when we've got something we need to wrestle with, whether it's a situation, whether it's a feeling, whether it's a circumstance, whether it's a relationship or something that we want breakthrough on, it's important to get alone with God. Not public. Sometimes, it's always great to be here together and at different prayer meetings and different things and the events that we get to go to and the services that we get to be part of and the opportunities for it's great. But a lot of time, breakthrough happens when you're alone with God. Jesus says in Matthew 6, when you pray, shut the door. And there is something different in that dynamic. In my own life, I recognize a sincerity. I talk to God maybe more bluntly than I do publicly. And I think that's what God wants, is sincerity. Out of this encounter, Jacob came out both blessed and battered. Some victories have a cost. Wrestling for what you want with God will have a cost. He wrestled through the night. And when we're wrestling over some deep issues in our lives, we're really fearful about a situation that we're going to face. It may feel like nighttime. But when the day dawns, we can stop. Because when the day dawned, the man said, you need to let go of me. It's daytime. Jacob went into that night crippled with worry about what was going to happen when he met his brother. He came into the daylight, blessed by God, and having his faith renewed. He said, I will not let go until you bless me. That pleased God, because God changed his identity at that moment. He said, you were called Jacob, which means deceiver. You are now called Israel, because you have striven with man and God, and you have overcome. He didn't receive his blessing through deception like he had previously. He received it through perseverance and faith. God's plan for Jacob wasn't based on his worthiness or his great conduct or character, because as we've seen, he was a scamp. God changed Jacob's character through this encounter. God's plan and purpose for Jacob is based on his own goodness and grace, which brings hope for all of us. God had promised Jacob that he would prosper and that his descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be counted. The question this morning is, what has God promised you? Even if you flee from the things in your life, the mistakes, the pain, the sin, God is with you. And just in closing, after this, Jacob's walk was changed because his hip had been put out. When you encounter God in this real way, your walk is changed. Maybe not physically, but your walk with God. You will behave differently. Something will change. And with this, everybody would have been able to see that something had changed with Jacob. It's the same for us. When we encounter God, we are changed. And everybody should be able to see. Our struggling and wrestling in faith leads to blessing. At the end of the story, Esau hugged his brother, and everything was fine. An important part just before that was when Jacob called Esau Lord. He denounced the birthright that he'd stolen from him, the one that he'd manipulated Esau into giving him, because he'd received a greater blessing. The things that he took for himself were no match for what God had given him. He had put it right. So whatever it is that we may have taken for ourselves and we think is great and important, whether it's success, and you may have worked hard for it, whether it's money, whether it's popularity, whether it's reputation, all of these things that you may have taken for yourself and worked hard for and strived, they're no match for what God's blessing will give you. And just in closing, I just want to ask two questions. What is it that you have fled from? What is it that you are fleeing from? And you need to turn back and face. Because within that, God is with you. And in dealing with that, you could unlock the destiny that God has for you. So get your wrestling kit on. Amen.